The last section in this chapter is about molecular compounds, when we share electrons. Back in ionic compounds, when we had a metal, so this is our metal and nonmetal, this is our abbreviation. When we had a metal and a nonmetal, the metals would give away their electrons to become a +1, a +2, or +3. And the nonmetals would gain electrons. They would become a -1, a -2, or a -3. So they were held together by an ionic bond because we had charges, we had ions, positive and negative ions. But with covalent compounds, we share electrons. Notice how the nonmetal on the left has one outermost electron that is unpaired, and the one on the right has one that's unpaired. So we share those electrons, and therefore the guy on the left now has 2, 4, 6, 8, and the guy on the right has 2, 4, 6, 8. So they each have 8 by sharing that middle one, and we can see that they're both happy in that covalent bond. So your learning goal for this section is, given the formula of a molecular compound, write its name, and given the name of the molecular compound, write its formula. A molecular compound contains 2 or more nonmetals that form a covalent bond. The outermost electrons, or the valence electrons, are shared by nonmetal atoms in a covalent bond to achieve stability. When 2 or more atoms share electrons, they form a molecule. In molecular compounds, we use prefixes to indicate the number of nonmetals. The prefix mono is not used on the first nonmetal of the compound. For example, NO2 would be named nitrogen dioxide. There's one nitrogen. We do not say mono if there's one of the first. Kind of like you all probably know this compound, carbon dioxide. We don't say monocarbon dioxide. That's the only time we do not use a prefix, is if the first nonmetal listed has one of them. Now, when the vowels O and O, or A and O, appear together, we smush them together. For example, carbon monoxide. We would say monoxide, but we smush one of those O's out of the way, so it's not monoxide, it's monoxide. Notice, though, that we did not just call this carbon oxide. We did have to say that there was one of the second element. We had to say carbon monoxide. We had to use the mono to say that there is one of the second. Here's the list of prefixes. You need to know these. Mono, di, tri, tetra, penta, hexa, hepta, octa, nona, and deca. Here are some common molecular compounds. I think you're familiar with carbon dioxide. CS2 is carbon disulfide. NO is nitrogen, that should say monoxide. N2O is dinitrogen monoxide. SF6, sulfur hexafluoride. SO2 is sulfur dioxide, and SO3 is sulfur trioxide. Can you name this compound NCl3? Hopefully you looked at this and you said nitrogen and chlorine. Look at your periodic table and you discovered that nitrogen is a nonmetal and chlorine is a nonmetal. So it is a molecular compound. And because of that, we have to use prefixes. There's one nitrogen, so we just say nitrogen. There's 3 chlorines, so we would say trichloride. Nitrogen trichloride. Write the formula for the molecular compound diboron trioxide. Hopefully you saw that diboron means 2 borons, so B2. Trioxide means 3 oxygens, B2O3. Here's a summary of naming ionic molecular compounds. If it's an ionic compound, we already covered this part. But if it's a molecular compound, we notice that it's 2 nonmetals. For the first nonmetal, we use a prefix to tell us how many there are, except if there's one of them, we do not use a prefix. For the second one, we use a prefix and we end in "ide." Can you pause the video here and identify each of the following compounds as ionic or molecular and write its name? So pause the video here. Hopefully you noticed in part A that Ni is nickel. It's a metal. And if it's a metal, this is ionic. So we know that this is nickel. That's the first name. That means that this is a polyatomic ion. So we need to go back and look at our cheat sheet to figure out what SO4 is. And hopefully you found that SO4 is sulfate. And sulfate has a -2 charge. It shows us that right on our cheat sheet. If it has a -2 charge, that means there should be a 2 down here next to the nickel. But there isn't. So that means that nickel must be a +2 charge in order to cancel that other -2 out to give us a neutral compound. So we would name this nickel 2 sulfate. For part B, hopefully you looked at this and you said, well, the two elements are both nonmetals, so it's a molecular compound. That means we need to tell us how many of each there are. Because there's one of the sulfur, we would say sulfur, and there's 3 oxygens, so we would say trioxide. Sulfur trioxide. Now I want you to be careful when you're naming compounds because SO3 we just said was sulfur trioxide. Be careful that you do not call this compound aluminum trichloride. They look very similar. There's one of the first elements and there's 3 of the second elements. But the difference is these contain 2 nonmetals, so it's a molecular compound. This compound, the first element listed, is a metal. So this is an ionic compound, and we name ionic compounds by just the first name and the last name. This would be aluminum chloride. We do not use prefixes when we have a metal involved. We use prefixes when they're both nonmetals, so you have to use your periodic table. Be sure to take a minute and look at your learning goals to make sure that you understand this section. Here is a concept map going over everything that we learned in Chapter 6. Here are the end of the chapter sample problems. So I would like for you to do the try it first and pause the video before looking at the solutions at the bottom. Here's another set, and the answers are on the bottom, but pause and don't look at the answers until after you tried the top part by yourself. Here's another try it first. Again, the solutions at the bottom. Another, here's the top part with the answer on the bottom. Do the try it first. This one, the answer's on the next page. Now be sure to let me know if you have any problems or any questions about any of these. Shoot me an email.